the panelist has been up early to be testing all the devices with us, and we are very excited to be here. Awesome. So without further ado, we have a very full house. We have an esteemed panel that has been really up early or late into the night, like Salil there with the dark background, and everybody is very much welcome to have a riveting discussion on the business in times of disruption, leading by example during and after the COVID-19 crisis. So without further ado, I would like to pass the torch to Namit, who will be starting the presentation in 5. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Namit, I pass the floor to you.
Thanks, Aim. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session. My name is Namit, and I will be moderating this session. As you all know, this session will look at issues of business in times of disruption and explore how businesses can, are, or not leading by example in this COVID-19 crisis. We must have all heard or read about stakeholder capitalism as a term becoming quite popular recently. CEOs from across the globe have shown their support for ideas of purpose-driven corporations and businesses. A crisis like this is perhaps a litmus test for such a commitment. Nobody knew that, a litmus test on such concept will come so soon. COVID-19 has disrupted what one can imagine or cannot imagine. Everything is disrupted right now. We see societal, political, and economic chaos caused by the pandemic, and it has posed significant challenges for businesses to act responsibly as well as respect human rights. We've also seen across the globe, and particularly in this region, Asia Pacific, how the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on workers, women, and migrants specifically. We've also seen indifference from governments and several businesses to be able to effectively address such issues. And then there are also leaders who are distinguishing themselves from laggards to contribute positively in addressing some of these issues in their respective contexts. I have a very distinguished panel today to discuss some of these issues. I would start by introducing myself and then introduce all the panelists to you. I work for World Benchmarking Alliance. I'm based in New Delhi and focus on public policy in Asia. World Benchmarking Alliance is a mission-driven organization trying to transform how businesses contribute to sustainable development in general, but sustainable development goals in particular. We have identified 2,000 keystone companies. We call them SDG 2000 companies. And we believe that these are the companies who have the maximum potential to influence SDGs and help the world deliver to the SDGs. We are in the process of developing several benchmarks to assess these SDG 2000 companies across 7 system transformations. And we do this by benchmarking these companies in specific sectors and working with companies, governments, as well as investors in bringing about change. With me today, we have a distinguished panel. To begin with, Josephine Setiano. Josephine has more than 3 decades of experience working in the private sector. She's the executive director of Indonesia Global Compact Network since 2015. Prior to this, she has worked with companies like General Electric, among other companies as well. And she has received several awards for her outstanding volunteering and community service. Welcome, Josephine. I'm also joined by Cynthia Ann Peterson. Cynthia is a principal social performance at Petronas at the group level. She has been in the energy industry for over a decade with international experience in managing social risks across the life cycle of the upstream and downstream business. She also has experience in developing sustainability strategy and sustainability reporting. Welcome, Cynthia, and thanks for joining us. Also joined by Anisha Rajapakse. Anisha is currently based in Sri Lanka as the Director of Stakeholder Engagement at Fair Labor Alliance. supporting companies to ethically recruit and manage workforces and mitigate risk of illegal and unethical exploitation. Anisha is a senior global expert with 2 decades of progressive experience working at the intersection of human rights, business, and international development. She also has experience of working with corporates, governments, international bodies, promoting the business and human rights agenda towards ensuring safe jobs and dignified working conditions. Thanks, Anisha, for joining us. Also joined by Sofia Arias. Sofia is a responsible business engagement consultant at the UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub. Prior to joining UNDP, Sofia was the Senior Business Integrity Program Manager with Transparency International Cambodia. Her work in human rights has also included access to justice, pre-trial detention, and gender-based violence issues in Southeast Asia and Africa. She is also a qualified lawyer. Last but not least, Salil Tripathi. Salil is a writer and policy advisor with experience in researching corporate activities, applying international human rights standards. He works across sectors and stakeholders to build accountability and advocate positive change. At the Institute of Human Rights and Business, Salil is Senior Advisor Global Issues and is the principal author of the recent report published by IHRB on corporate responsibility to respect human rights during COVID pandemic. Salil joins us from New York and almost close to midnight, so he's the most committed among all of us. Thanks, Salil, for joining us. Without further ado, I would like to invite Salil to make some opening comments, particularly focusing on what you are observing, Salil, with the COVID-19 disruptions in the context of business and human rights. What do you see at the global level? Also looking at the report and how you've interacted with some of the stakeholders in this whole situation. Also highlighting some examples of how businesses are responding. Over to you, Salil. Salil, you're on mute. Just a second for.
No, I've changed it. Yeah. And I just said, no, you want me to do all of this in 2 minutes. Am I right?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, thank you. And yes, I mean, it's still early. I mean, I'm doing another session tomorrow at what is my 3 a.m. So compared to that, this is a very human time. I can tell you that. But this is one of those unique situations for companies in this environment, because usually when companies have dealt with major disruptive instances, they often have had a role to play as people causing an abuse or contributing to an abuse, to go back to the terminology that we've got from the UN guiding principles. You very often have situations where either companies are directly responsible for something that has happened or something in which they played a major role in letting it happen. This is one crisis when it happened, the pandemic. Companies did not have a role. We have a lot to say in our report about where the governments have got it wrong. Some governments have got it right. And so let's name the ones who have done well, South Korea being one. We also know that there has been some very good early decisions taken in Germany. And we also know of some very good decisions made in New Zealand. So there are a few instances like that where governments have done well. Singapore also began very well and then it had problems. But then there are some countries which have either tried to suppress information. I mean, People's Republic of China initially. Some countries which were in denial, Brazil being one, and the United States, at least at the federal level, being one such, and India about the way it reacted with the way it had the lockdown and the way it was implemented. All those are issues where there have been major human rights consequences. And companies now have to deal with the situation of a major disruption and how they can act in it. So what we did in our report was that we identified certain major areas where risks are very visible and palpable. Working from home sounds like a very good idea if you have the ability to work from home, of technology, of access to high-speed internet and broadband, space within the home, not having other responsibilities. And if you're a woman, the whole prospect of working in an environment which could be hostile to you. If you're also a caregiver, what happens to the woman when she is also in a situation where she has to look after people who might be sick and elderly and look after the family itself. So all those things were issues which companies needed to think through, that it's one thing to say, and only certain jobs. I mean, one statistic is that only 20% of the jobs can be done from home. The others cannot be. Who is an essential worker? That became a challenge for companies to identify. And the companies had to start looking at constituencies that they were dealing with in three different ways. One was their own staff, and therefore as a corollary, also the supply chain. The second was their consumers and customers. What about their own protection? You're running a supermarket and your customers coming in, how to protect them and how to protect your own staff from them in case either party is asymptomatic or has been affected. And the third is the public at large. Now, this becomes very important for companies in the internet sphere, Facebook, YouTube, Google. What kind of information should you allow? What kind of information should you allow in the public domain? What if people are denying? What if people are projecting stories about conspiracies, that it was developed in a lab somewhere, or that if you have turmeric or if you consume bleach, you will be fine. I mean, people in different parts of the world have said different kinds of things. And what is the responsibility of the company when it comes to disseminating it? Now, some companies have done very well in providing protecting gear, gloves, sanitizers. I mean, I'm in New York here. Most of the goods I get at home delivered to me are, with social distancing and so on. But then there are other companies which were either unwilling to give those masks to their employees because they were worried that if they were to do that, it would end up with people getting exposed. I mean, the company would look bad, or that it would scare the audiences, scare the people around it. So that was one area where companies got it wrong. Some companies did not pay their workers sufficiently. Some companies were also forcing workers to go and also not giving them adequate leave and so on. So there are all kinds of issues where the workers are involved in the interface where it has gone bad. And there is a story I want to come back to, which I will come back to later, is some extremely exemplary conduct, such as what H&M, the Swedish company, did with garments in Bangladesh. But we'll come to that later.
Thanks, Salil. Thanks a lot for giving us that opening perspective. With that, I would like to invite Sophia. And I believe UNDP recently published a report looking at the impact more at the regional level at Asia Pacific. And if you could just highlight, I mean, what are the major socioeconomic impacts that in the report, but in general, you have observed in the region? And also, are there any good examples of business actions or bad examples that you would like to share?
Good morning, Naman, and thank you. And good morning to the other panelists. Good evening, Salil, and to those tuning in online. I wanted to start this session with some data related to the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 in the region. And a few of these points do come from UNDP's report on socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 in Asia Pacific that was published in April. In this region, as in many parts of the world, we are seeing supply chain disruptions, travel restrictions, and lockdowns that have had extensive economic consequences. Many businesses have reduced or temporarily closed their operations, raising uncertainties and concerns on corporate and household debt. The ADB has estimated that under a 3-month containment scenario, countries in Asia and the Pacific were predicted to experience $1.7 trillion in economic losses. China, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam have recorded elevated domestic debt, mostly in the corporate sector. With lower corporate earnings and greater debt servicing, burdens on companies potentially leading to job losses, plunging investor defaults and investor confidence, and potentially triggering a widespread credit crunch and a financial crisis. 1/2 of Asia Pacific economies are recording fiscal debts, which are relatively high in Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and Cambodia. The crisis has highlighted the vulnerabilities of SMEs, which in many countries in the region are the backbone of the economy and are often amongst the hardest hit. I think the bottom line here is the COVID-19 has created a significant struggle for survival for businesses in this region as well as globally. So in turning to the corporate response to COVID-19, both the ugly and the good, We've seen cancellation of manufacturing contracts leading to millions of jobs and wages lost. And I think Anisha will speak about the many risks to labor and employees. So I wanted to highlight some of the additional business and human rights risks that we're seeing outside of the labor context. We're seeing corporate surveillance in the workplace, discrimination and xenophobia, not addressing the needs of women, particularly as caregivers outside of the workplace, not respecting the rights of vulnerable and marginalized populations, and not considering the communities in which businesses operate. And turning to the good, there are examples of corporates leveraging their support in the region. In India, the biggest corporates are supporting the response to COVID-19, where they have committed together $150 million towards immediate COVID-19 related humanitarian aid and augmented healthcare capacity and treatment. In Malaysia, companies have contributed $5.5 million to the COVID fund launched by the government to help people affected by the outbreak. Vietnam's largest conglomerate has announced that it is now producing ventilators and body thermometers, leveraging capacity from automobiles and electric plants. And while these examples highlight some of the corporate social responsibility and philanthropic actions of companies, we also know that during COVID-19, companies must also continue to assess and address human rights risks in their operations and in their supply chains. We've seen some good examples of this, of the operational responses by companies, including honoring supplier contracts, offering employee healthcare coverage and protection, protecting indigenous populations in the communities where they operate, and continuing to assess and address the risks, even if that means conducting virtual human rights due diligence. In April, UNDP's B+HR Asia released the HRDD and COVID-19, a rapid self-assessment for business, which offers guidance to business on identifying and addressing adverse human rights impacts in their business operations during times of disruption. The RSA has received significant positive feedback from companies, industry associations, and civil society groups. Businesses have shared the RSA with their supply chains, embedded the RSA in their human rights tracking, and plan to use it as guidance for their recovery. With the RSA, we've hoped to provide an initial guidance for companies on striking this balance and identifying and addressing human rights risks in their operations and supply chains with their need for survival, even during a time of crisis. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. And I think, your speaker volume was slightly lower. So maybe next time, if you can just try and adjust the speaker or bring the mic closer.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Right. And with that, Anisha, I would like to bring you in and get your perspective on what you've been observing, particularly on the workers and the labor front in the region, and looking at specifically the impact that COVID-19 has had on workers in general, but looking at women, informal workers, and migrants specifically. And are there examples in the region where you have seen companies doing well and taking care of their responsibilities for the workers?
Thank you, Namit, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Sri Lanka. So what I'd like to put into context is like some examples from the region, focusing on a few of the countries, particularly South Asia. So often pre-existing social vulnerabilities only get worse following a disaster. And this pandemic is a perfect example of that, and one that has actually magnified the social inequalities to a whole new level. In April, the ILO estimated that around 305 million full-time jobs are likely to have been globally lost in the second quarter of this year. And Oxfam reports that around 500 million globally could be thrown back into poverty. And in this scenario, groups such as migrant workers and workers in the informal economy, many of whom are women, are particularly affected by the economic consequences of this virus. And significant job losses in the private sector of the Gulf states have actually forced so many Asian migrant workers to return home, or actually desperately waiting to get home at this moment. They're largely engaged in lower medium skilled employment categories, such as the construction sector and also domestic workers. informal economy workers are up against, excuse me, work or lose your income dilemma. To pay their food and basic expenses, they often continue to work, forced to work until measures to limit the virus comes along, and then they can stop. So this compounds the economic insecurity they already face. So according to recent figures from IOM and the ILO, there are 9 million Bangladeshi migrant workers, and half of them are working in the Gulf states. And Bangladesh receives approximately $18 billion from migrant labor remittances. 10 million Indian nationals are working in the Gulf, and it's estimated that between 10 and 15% of them will be returning to India. Nearly 1 million Nepalese are working in the Gulf, and the country is highly dependent on remittances, amounting to approximately 28% of Nepal's GDP. And to date, about 1.7 million Sri Lankan migrants are employed abroad, mainly in the Gulf states, and the country receives over $7 billion annually as remittances. And around 97.4% are domestic workers and 78% are low-skilled workers. Earnings from foreign remittances is considered as one of the main streams of foreign exchange revenue to Sri Lanka. And now with COVID, this is going to drastically drop. So what is unfolding across the Asia Pacific region is really disturbing. Apart from job loss, most have not even been paid and forced by employers to take unpaid leave or reduced wages, and often confined to poor living conditions. What even compounds the situation even more is that many migrant workers are also struggling with the challenge of wanting to return home or remain stranded in the countries without little or no access to support services and housed in risky facilities, which are posing as quarantine facilities. So many countries right now are employing a phased strategy to bring back their workers, because quite honestly, a lot of the countries lack the capacity to bring them in immediately in numbers. So in this climate, the returnees also face being stigmatized when they do come back, because people believe that they are at high risk for transmission, and also the additional strain that they're placing on an already weak economy. And losing their job also means that migrant workers risk losing their right to stay in the country that they're working in, because visas and work permits are often linked to their specific employment. And this poses a real risk as they become undocumented by overstaying their visa. In turn, they risk becoming easy prey to unscrupulous gangs who exploit the vulnerabilities by promising to get them home at a huge price, and instead sell them potentially to human traffickers or corrupt recruiters who see them as ways to make a quick buck in these challenging times. And as always, women are the most affected by this. So in terms of the trends that I've been observing in the region is the fact that COVID-19 has actually been an acid test for businesses. I've heard the saying, crisis doesn't change people, it reveals them. And this rings true for companies. In my discussions with various companies, it's been evident that companies that have long-term suppliers and supplier relationships based on trust have weathered the COVID storm much more effectively than the others. Going forward, of course, it's in the best interest of the businesses to do this. And as a speaker said in a session yesterday, they need to essentially commit, communicate, and collaborate with their suppliers and stakeholders. And progressive companies actually have kept employees working where possible, but only under the safest available conditions. And they operate on the premise that protecting employees' health is not just the humane thing to do, but helps the business ramp back more quickly when the risks subside. And in this day and age, irrespective of the size of a company, people know what salient business risks are. It doesn't need to be hammered on again. So to build back better after COVID and strengthen the resilience of their businesses, it's kind of a no-brainer that the current crisis and accompanying responses need to be through a human rights lens. This is critical. And the virus has also been a test, as Namit also mentioned, on discussions about corporate purpose and stakeholder capitalism, and whether these are consequential debates or just more hot air. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Anisha. Thanks for giving that perspective on the worker side. I would also like to inform the participants that there is a functionality, and you can type in your questions there. We will have a specific slot towards the end to answer those questions, but feel free to type your questions right now. With that, I would like to bring Cynthia in. Cynthia, I mean, you are the only business representative on the panel, and we've already heard how the pandemic impacted the wider global regional stakeholders, but also looking at specifically the worker. It has definitely impacted businesses also in general, but I would like to also hear your perspective on how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted particularly the oil and gas sector, and how has your company Petronas responded to this crisis?
Thank you, Namit. And good morning, everyone, and good evening, Salil. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to speak on the business aspect of the COVID-19 response and thereafter. I mean, obviously, you know, as it was mentioned earlier, this crisis wasn't created by industry. We had to respond to it as part of society. And you know, there have been changes in the region, in globally as well, in terms of the impact of plummeting demand for energy products and the impact that it has caused, you know, socioeconomically all around the world. So as an industry, I just like to provide a little bit of an overview. The main focus are really for, I would say, four thrusts. Number one, the main focus would be protecting people who work in the industry, as well as the communities that live, you know, adjacent to all our operations. So the second thing I would like to say is that, you know, as mentioned by, you know, the last couple of speakers on the supply chain, so support for the value chain in this industry is really critical because over 80% of our work is really conducted by the value chain. The third thing that, as an industry, that we're focusing on, you know, to get us through this pandemic and come out stronger at the other end is leveraging on the capability that we already have. I mean, I'll just give you a very brief example. For you know, the Petronas Mercedes F1 team, for example, what they did was they used the engineering know-how that they had to, you know, produce ventilators. So that's what they did. That really helped out, especially you know, in Europe, where initially you know, the need for ventilators was very high. Last but not least, you know, each company is looking at how we can strengthen, you know, our finances and make sure that we have enough resilience, or the resilience to get through this without deeply impacting our workforce. So as an industry broadly, I'd like to say that, you know, these are the 4 areas that we're looking at. As Petronas, we're pretty much aligned to these 4 areas as well, because primarily, you know, we don't work in a vacuum, we work in a value chain. So, you know, protecting our people is key. What we've done is, you know, we've helped to repatriate our staff from all around the world back to Malaysia. We've also conducted, you know, rapid COVID-19 testing for staff, because the energy industry in Malaysia particularly is considered as an essential industry. So technically we never really stopped working. So we have that. And, you know, more on a humanitarian perspective, we've provided close to $5 million US for medical equipment in Malaysia. And, you know, as staff, you know, what we've done is we've raised about $1.5 million, you know, to various causes to help ease the impact of COVID-19 on industries outside ours. So I think I'd like to stop there with that overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think that was really helpful. And with that, I would like to turn to you, Josephine. And you've also, as part of the Global Compact Network in Indonesia, done a survey of your member companies and trying to assess what's the response of the companies and what is the impact on the companies. If you would just like to highlight what are the key issues that emerge from this survey, and if there are any good examples that you would like to share. To unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I just want to say good morning, everyone, to the distinguished panelists and all the participants of this session. What I would like to say in the first place is that based on what we have felt and experienced with in the crisis so far, we have been struck by the many lessons it holds for business and society, its effects and responses to it. This will totally change the way they do business going forward. Now, companies are now recognizing that working from home is not such a bad idea. Companies can be more receptive to agile working. For working moms or dads, maybe an opportunity to be with their babies by working from home. We may not need such a big office to hold such a big group anymore, creating a lot of efficiency and operational cost reduction. There is a recent business and society research in time of the corona, which reports, and this is also what reveals from our survey, I would say brief survey, the differential effects of COVID are clearly evident across industries and organizations. We learned that in the short term, travel industries, hotel, tourism, and hospitality industries have been hit the hardest, while the health sector organizations are at the forefront of these, including the food sector. Now, within these industries, some organizations are affected more than the others, and some in these organizations are affected sooner than the others. For example, a number of businesses in property and hotel industries were pushed to make necessary steps by having to making employees, layoffs. However, we also see that those corporations having involved in diversified industries, in other industries, they may be hardly hit, but in the other industries like plantation, mining, which we learn are not hardly hit by the crisis, are most likely to survive the crisis. Now, one thing we learned from the quick survey is that companies pay great attention not only to the well-being of their employees and families, but they are also contributing to the external society. Our survey reveals that from the key members of the UN Global Compact in Indonesia alone, the total business contributions up until now has reached around rupiah 183 billion, around 13 million USD. Strategic investment is around $35.7 million. And at the same time, the crisis has benefited some organizations. For example, surgical mask production, hand sanitizer, disinfectant. These have been hard to find in the market and the prices are sky increasing, but some businesses are benefiting from these. But we also see that a number of SMEs are also making pivotal changes, switching, utilizing most of the digital for marketing, for communicating their products. To some business, this crisis is a wake-up call for them to be prepared with contingency plan, prepare with plan A, plan B, plan ahead, quickly grab opening business opportunity, make pivotal changes, and make sure business has projected cash flow, because in the crisis, cash is king. Now, any good example of the network members collaborating collectively responding to the pandemic? Yes. IGCN and Dr. Sher, a member of the Global Compact, see our common values and we agree to the same mission, which is to strengthen the healthcare workers and doctors in charge in the front line by providing them with adequate personal protective equipment, or we call it PPE. Now we know that at the beginning, the corona spreading, we're losing doctors and healthcare workers, sadly, due to the being infected by the virus because of lack of adequate PPE. So the collaboration has put together donations from businesses, from individuals, from the community. And to date, we have distributed the PPE in packages to almost around 150 hospitals in 64 districts, 35 cities, spread in 27 provinces. And this is still continuing. But where or how did we start with that? There is a pre-work that we needed to do. As we know that accountable data-driven baseline is very important. So something like what PPE types are needed by the hospitals, what's the volume they need, where are the locations. This data is crucial in announcing, sort of calling for support from donors or contributors.
Right.
Yeah, so Dr. Shah have the support from businesses, school students in SEAT who did the survey mapping and hospital in the network using the technology. So there was a pre-work survey utilizing the geomapping. The Dr. Shah came out with a map of the hospitals who are in need of the PPE. This is real time, real data, real hospital that has all the detailed information about the hospital facility. I think with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. I think that's very useful. And if I may, have a follow-up question, starting with you, Josephine, and then also inviting the other panelists to chip in. I mean, we have seen both extremes. On one hand, the impact has also been, disproportionate. There are certain categories of workers and communities who are more impacted than others. And like you mentioned, even different sectors have seen different kind of impact of the crisis. But in a sense, what's also very, very visible is it is a fight of survival. Businesses are struggling to choose between surviving and respecting human rights.
Right.
And in this sort of a scenario, it appears as if it's a zero-sum game, that if businesses go forward and start supporting the communities and stakeholders, it might have a negative impact on their own survival and economics as such. How do you see that panning out in Indonesia, but also, learning from the member companies that you have in your network?
Yeah, right. Well, as part of the UN Global Compact, companies are guided by the 10 principles, of course, the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact in performing their business operations by implementing respect to human rights, to its workers, to its environment, and the businesses and be a business that is fair, transparent, accountable, and anti-corruption. So study has proven that business that is operating in a responsible way are likely to survive long term. So it's a choice for the business. Investors are looking at the ESG report and making a decision to invest. Business that is well governed will be investors' preference to invest.
Thanks, Josephine. And Sophia, if I may now come to you, and you've also engaged with a lot of businesses and looked at a lot of these studies. What's your analysis? What's the difference? How are businesses going to balance this difficult situation?
Thanks, Namit. So as I was saying, and hopefully you can hear me a bit better now, I think the businesses who have already put the systems in place in terms of their human rights due diligence, being able to monitor and assess and evaluate the impacts in their operations and in their supply chain, businesses who have relationships with their suppliers. I think we've seen, and companies have made the case, that companies who build these relationships with their suppliers, with communities where they operate, they invest in and they're concerned about their employees, they seek to assess and address their human rights impacts and have the plans in place, ultimately are more resilient, even in a time of crisis. I think that the balance here looks like respect for human rights is not mutually exclusive with profits. And I think that there's growing evidence that companies who care about governance and integrity and are putting measures in place to monitor their social and environmental impacts are becoming more resilient. We're already seeing some evidence of that in terms of ESG. Companies who've implemented ESG frameworks are performing better during this period. And ultimately, I think resilience created through investing in human rights and corporate governance is a competitive advantage for companies who seek to survive, particularly as the world faces future pandemics or crises related to climate change.
Thanks, Sophia. Salil, if I may bring you in this, and in your opening comments, you mentioned that this is a particular situation where businesses have not caused or contributed. But do you also see, in a sense, that businesses who have not invested in systemic transformations and looking at long-term planning, whether it's sustainability or otherwise, how do you see those businesses kind of balancing in this kind of a situation, choosing between, or if choosing is the right word or not, but trying to mitigate this fine balance?
So when you put the question in those terms, it biases the question towards large businesses, right? Because only large businesses can think long term. I mean, if you're a supplier in Bangladesh, for example, you have to haggle for every contract with Walmart and Asda and Marks and Spencer and Gap and Nike and companies like that. You have 3,000 other competing companies, and you have to literally fight over the last cent for what you're doing. So it can become a disproportionate burden on the smaller businesses to think long term. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. So you're right, absolutely, that if companies have thought long term, then they should certainly think in terms of acting in a more responsible manner. And you do see that in some respects. I mean, the example that was earlier given of companies such as Daimler and Petronas being able to switch gears, from what they're actually manufacturing to manufacturing what is necessary is a great one. And some companies in Bangladesh started doing that. Once they were no longer making T-shirts, they started making personal protective equipment. I mean, it happened with New Balance, this sneakers company, which makes sneakers and shoes and athletic equipment in America. They started making, instead of that, they started making facial masks. Armani is doing the same in Italy. So there are companies like that which were able to switch, of course, seeing a business opportunity. The other thing, that a case I heard yesterday on a panel from somebody from one of our Indian panelists, Priya Naik, Shamhita, it's a CSR enabling nonprofit organization. I'm not sure whether it's a company or not, but what they said was something very interesting, that some of the companies are actually looking at the workers that they do not need because demand has fallen. We have to remember that these companies are not charitable outfits. They are not hiring people and doing good for the society. I mean, they're hiring people because they need them as workers. When that contract collapses, they try to match their skills with the skills of other industries which need them. I saw that in the US, for example, where hotel industry, which was downsizing, was able to retrain or at least realign with their workforce with companies such as Amazon and Uber, which wanted people who are able to deliver and courier. So these are short-term measures, but at least it makes sure that income streams are continuing. So I think companies which were able to see beyond that and seeing that in a more flexible way would be able to, but everybody is essentially making decisions on the run. There is no rule book to go to. UN guiding principles are great, but they only tell you mitigate harm and do the right thing. Beyond that, what to do is pretty much going to be an improvised way.
Absolutely, thanks for that. And in fact, I mean, in one of the panels yesterday or day before, somebody was also mentioning how companies, and I think this was an example from India, where companies responded to the call of the government to provide funding to PM cares. And on the same hand, they were not able to pay the workers the full salaries and wages. They were also firing workers in some cases. So it ended up where they were trying to either support financially or try and manufacture either PPE kits or ventilators on one hand, but on the other hand, it realized that they are not in a position to pay the full wages, or they will not be requiring some of those workers. And so I think that was quite a stark example of how companies are responding in the same situation.
I just had a question in the Q&A from somebody from India who did ask me exactly that why is it that companies are not doing more for CSR? And that's the thing that came through in our panel yesterday, where one of the panelists had made exactly the same point, that they would love to pay more for CSR, but PM Cares is crowding out the effect by taking away the funds which they could have made more directly more relevant in their own field. So I think that centralized model is actually hurting the project.
Right. Okay. And Anisha, if I may now bring you in, and you also mentioned about businesses, some businesses doing good, some businesses not being able to respond in the right manner. How do you see this balance playing out from where you see businesses and engage with them?
So what I've seen is essentially also, like, just to echo some of the things that Salil said, it's very true, because this is like totally unprecedented and businesses had no warning, no preparation. So they are literally, kind of, hitting the ground running on this and trying to do the best. But at the same time, government essentially also has a primary responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, but that's not enough. So government has also been trying to call on the private sector, and I've seen a lot of the like companies who are part of the Fair Labor Alliance, for example, have worked cooperatively with government as well as civil society on this matter. So, for example, the DBL group in Bangladesh, which is one of the largest apparel manufacturing companies, who has also been really hit badly by the brands pulling out and not fulfilling their commitments and paying. So they actually have funded the medical personnel transport for them in terms of when the lockdown was on, so that people get access to care and treatment. And at the same time, they've ensured that the workers continue to be paid. And it's the same with another company that I know in Doha, called Al Jasra. They're in the maintenance sector, so to speak, so which means they are responsible for providing security to all the essential service. So like it includes hospitals and so on. So they continued regardless, and they looked after their workers and ensured that they were, in addition to getting their salary, that they would also get other food and stuff to kind of meet their cultural needs as well. And very often, like in Bangladesh also, in Doha, in Qatar, the government has given support to businesses. So in Bangladesh, they've given 3 months salary that the companies could get, but they're on zero interest, and that they could pay back from January in installments. And it's the same also in Qatar. It was given like that. But the thing is, very often, a lot of the companies haven't taken the government up on this, because there's no guarantee that in 3 months, I mean, how are they going to pay that back? If, like say in Bangladesh, if the orders don't come in, they're going to be left high and dry. So they are kind of preparing, they're also scaling down, but at the same time, they are viewing this from the perspective of, of the businesses and as well as the workers. And quite honestly, the Bangladesh sector, apparel sector, I mean, it's been pretty appalling to see what's going on. And if not for some of the concerted lobbying by the likes of the by various activist groups, as well as other agencies, they wouldn't, even the ones who have kind of paid up wouldn't. And the other issue that a lot of the companies are feeling is also a sense of anger as well at the double standards and the hypocrisy that is demonstrated by these brands who claim, overall to be very ethical, adhering to sustainability, and really beating the drum, and also getting these suppliers in these countries to jump through hoops in order to be sustainable and be ethical. I mean, see what they're doing now. So, and also what are the various business associations, industry associations, compliance initiatives, what is it that they're doing? And the fact that issuing statements of solidarity, urging businesses to pay up, I mean, that's not enough. So when is it that the companies are going to be accountable? And what are those organizations going to do about it when these brands do not fulfill what they committed to doing when they signed up for these things?
Thanks, Anisha. And Cynthia, if I may come to you, And as a company, these are obviously very, very difficult challenges. Nobody is prepared to deal with this. And you mentioned that particularly in the oil and gas sector, the demand suddenly vanished, and there was a sudden economic impact on companies such as yours. How do you see companies kind of tackling this issue of fine balance between responding versus surviving?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I just like to preface my answer by saying, in the energy sector specifically, we did have some exposure to previous pandemics like Ebola or H1N1, but never at a scale like this. So, echoing what some of the other panelists have said, it's not a choice between human rights and surviving. I think human rights ensures survival of a company because the energy sector is approaches its business in a risk-based manner. So if you take a risk-based approach and coming back to the UN guiding principles, due diligence is something which all of us can agree, is probably key. For our company, I mean, I personally believe that the measures that you have in terms of due diligence will really demonstrate how much respect you have for human rights. So in terms of surviving, I think doing the basic things right, getting them right is really important. Meaning to say that we need to assess our supply chain. In the energy sector, it's quite interesting because unlike the garment industry or agriculture, issues such as migrant workers or undocumented workers is not really front and center. Most of our suppliers are sometimes peers, and most of the work is highly skilled work, and which excludes sometimes some of the scenarios you get in other sectors. But interestingly enough, when the pandemic first hit, especially in Malaysia, a lot of our second and third tier companies were really caught off guard because suddenly some of the projects that they may have had with other companies had kind of dried up, and then all of a sudden they're dependent on one or two contracts that are ongoing. So we did get a couple of a lot of feedback, not necessarily about us, but about the impact itself, that it had on their casual workers or their daily paid workers. These tend to be in more of a less engineering and more civil work. So that's the kind of thing that we've seen. I just like to say that really this pandemic has highlighted the need to really ensure proper risk management processes are really not just in place but implemented properly. And the other thing that we have seen is really the value of grievance mechanisms. When a grievance mechanism works well and it's effective, that's how you get the information that certain suppliers may or may not have been paying their workers, or they've suddenly experienced being furloughed. It's something which I think we need to be able to take into account to see how we can better design our relationship with suppliers in the future. Most of them who have been impacted are actually not in a contractual relationship with the main companies. They're in contractual relationships with other suppliers. So, I think the million-dollar question in the energy sector really is, how do we really put our arms around the supply chain conundrum? Most of us are often in relationships with our first tier, but contractually, legally, we're not in a relationship with the other companies down the chain. So we're still looking for that sweet spot. We're still working on it. Not just Petronas, but I think you could say the same for all the other companies within the energy space. Our supply chains are very large. We haven't got the kind of exposure, I think, to migrant issues or undocumented worker issues, or maybe the issue really is that they're hidden. So I would say that of course companies will survive in the energy sector. How we survive will remain to be seen. But I think most of us will focus on what we do best, which is risk management. And human rights is actually part of that risk management. So
Right.
I would say that that's the approach that we'll be taking.
Thanks, Cynthia. And I think, I mean, also looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and one of the questions talks about what Anisha, you mentioned that, I mean, there is a lot of hypocrisy in how brands project themselves and how they actually respond in times of crisis. And I would like to check with the other panelists. Do you largely agree with this, that there is hypocrisy in how brands project themselves and how they actually respond, or is there any disagreement on that?
Yeah, so I looked at that question, and I think it's a yes and no answer there. You know, I mean, I know Bangladesh a little bit, and it's a yes and no situation. That yes, some brands have been hypocritical because they are acting as though nothing has changed, and they have seen this as a what lawyers would call force majeure, which is where something catastrophic happens, which could not be anticipated, such as natural disaster or armed conflict, or in this case, a pandemic, gives the company an excuse to walk away from the contract. And basically it leaves the other parties, it's like musical chairs. I mean, you're playing and suddenly the music stops. So if you're caught standing, you're caught standing and you're out. I mean, that's what, in a way, at a very crude level is what's happening. But then there are other companies, and the one that we had on our own panel that we had at IHRB some time ago, H&M, they did the right thing, which was that they said that we will honor the contracts, and we had contracted to buy these amount of clothes, and we will buy it at the same price, now, which is admirable, which is what, but this is the tyranny of low expectations, that you are actually praising someone for doing what they're expected to do, but that's the situation we are in. I mean, we should commend companies when they do something exemplary, and this is not to undermine at all what H&M has done. What they've done is fantastic, that they've lived up to that promise, but that's where we are, that companies are not even living up to that promise. So to that extent, Anisha is right, but the caveat I would say that yes, there are other companies which are actually doing what they ought to do. And of course, in the longer term, I mean, it's nice to say that brands should pay more, and of course they should pay more, but we must remember that the brands, if they do pay more, the t-shirts we buy will also cost more. And I mean, are we willing to pay $10 for a t-shirt rather than $5 for a t-shirt? That's where it comes down to.
Thanks, Salil. And I think it's also interesting in terms of how brands kind of talk about risk management and due diligence is what Cynthia spoke about. But how far is it actually implemented or practiced is kind of revealed in a crisis like this, when you're suddenly caught off guard. None of your risk management metrics were able to indicate that there are these fault lines that exist. Workers are out of sort of not on payroll, not getting the right kind of wages, don't have protective equipment and occupational health and safety. So it's also about, I think, on the IHRB panel, I think somebody had mentioned that the pandemic has not created any of these situations. It has just made the invisible visible. So I think that's what is quite stark, I would say. And I think, yes, Anisha.
Sorry, Namit. Another thing would be like one of the things that we are also hearing from companies is like, what do we do like when governments, kind of suddenly spring regressive labor laws? I mean, there are examples, this was cited at, like, say, for example, in India, and the panel that Salil, moderated yesterday was really, really interesting on that. So this poses a problem for multinational companies, especially when they need to meet international legislation, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act and so on. So at all times, businesses need to be adhering to international human rights standards as a minimum, as provided by the UNGP. So supply chain due diligence has to go on regardless, because it is in the interests of the companies, but also for the people. It's really vital.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, there was a question from one of the participants as well, similar to this. How do companies respond when governments are sort of triggering this race to the bottom by either relaxing labor laws or other laws, environmental laws, which some companies, at least the leader companies, would know that it is not in the interest of the sector in the long term, but still choose not to engage or respond in a situation like this. Maybe Josephine, if I can come to you and get your perspective in terms of as a network, or if you've seen examples, or what's your perspective? What do companies do when they see governments responding in this sort of a manner?
Yeah, it's difficult, and sometimes it can be a dilemma for businesses. On the other hand, the government are telling them to do this. On the one hand, they have to face the reality of the business. So, which one to take? But what we see from the survey, actually, majority of the businesses try their best. One company, even they are in a property and hotel business. When they are trying to put some people at home or reducing their pay, they are being transparent. So they interview the employees and ask whether, okay, are you going to be hit 100%? Suppose you we put you at home without pay or reduce your pay. Does your husband still have income? Or on the other way around? So sometimes we need to put ourselves in the shoe of the business. Sometimes, my boss, Mr. Junardi in the Global Compact, always say, I be in both shoes as an NGO, as a business. And I see those two things that actually can be working together instead of pointing fingers. Because if you really enter the business and then try to understand what the businesses are doing and then suffering, it's a difficult situation for them to make a decision in order to keep the operations continue and survive.
Thanks, Josephine.
Yeah.
And Sophia, if I may come to you, because oftentimes, UNDP also engages with policymakers and governments and advising them on how, specifically on, say, business and human rights and national action plans in the region. And for example, in India, when we saw some of the state governments and also the central government trying to relaxing laws, giving this, answer that this is going to help businesses, come back better and deal with this economic crisis. But some of the businesses definitely understand and privately share that this is not in the interest of the economy as a whole. But governments still try to assume that this is going to help businesses. What's your take on this? Is there a role that UN or UNDP play in terms of advising governments on how to deal with this?
Sure. I think that UNDP has been working closely with the NAP development process in India and focusing on business and human rights. And I think now that process has slowed a bit because of COVID-19. And so now we have a situation where these issues have been propelled forward in terms of seeing how businesses affecting human rights during a crisis and sort of the friction that can arise between governments and business when governments try and respond in ways that businesses might not find effective or might hinder their ability to ensure that they have a productive labor force. And I think that UNDP will and the other UN actors will continue to work and engage in this dialogue with governments, especially as we focus on the recovery aspects of COVID-19. UNDP will be taking a leading role in some of the socioeconomic aspects in the socioeconomic recovery in this region and globally. And so I think as we continue to engage policymakers about how to have a business and human rights lens, how to have a human-centric lens in their recovery these issues will continue to be part of the dialogue. But I also think it's important to have the stakeholders in the dialogue, to include civil society, to include business, so that we can sort of get this balance right on how recovery can look and how we can, again, find this balance between a people-centric approach as in this recovery.
Salil, if I may now ask you to respond to the same question between the pillar 1 state duty and pillar 2, and how do you see things panning out? And you also mentioned the example in India. How do you see companies already engaging or not, and what should companies do to tell the governments what is in the best interest of the economy in the long term?
So, I mean, one thing we do know from development economics over the past, and this is not just about India, but any country, that if you try to make low labor cost and weak regulation as the only way to attract business, you will only get certain types of businesses, right? I mean, you will only get the most labor intensive, the dirty. I mean, there's a Japanese phrase of KKK, the dirty, dangerous, and degrading work, and that's why those jobs actually left Japan. If you want to go higher up the value chain, you actually want better paying jobs and with better security and protection, because those are the kind of jobs that are going to earn the kind of income that is going to boost the GDP. Right. So any country or any state or any region which tries to attract investment by lowering standards may get the illusion of jobs in the short run, but it won't be the kind of jobs that are sustainable, because tomorrow someone else will play the same game. I mean, exactly. Investment will just keep moving away. And I think given one lesson of the crisis has been that people want to diversify. They want to be all concentrated in one place, because China became the factory of the world. Once it's closed down, the whole rest of the world got stopped. And I think we have to move away from that. And if you want to move away from that, then you have to look at your competitive advantages. The skilling up of the workers and paying them better, respecting their rights, are going to be in the interest of the business. And that argument has to come from business. NGOs will make them, unions will make them, but business has to say that to the government, that this is the way forward. Only then the government will listen.
And do you see enough businesses saying that to the government, or no?
Well, the problem is that, I mean, we're talking about the Indian case where it's very hard to tell the government to do something, because then it may not do it. It might be quieter and easier ways of doing it, which is not the way it should be in transparent and open societies, but that's the situation we are in. So I think people will have to say it in a more circumspect way. And people who understand business and understand economics, if they are the ones who are taking these decisions, then it will be a better situation. But available evidence is not very encouraging. That's all I can say.
Okay, makes sense. Anisha, if I may come to you, and because there are also a lot of questions on the migrant worker crisis, which is obviously one of the greatest that we have seen in this region. How do you look at what can be done in the long term? In the short term, of course, I mean, there are a lot of these ideas floating around in terms of making sure that they reach wherever they want to go, providing them with immediate support. But that's not the solution. At the end of the day, the migrant workers will need to come back looking for jobs. The industries will also need workers to work for them. How do you see this whole situation, both from a policy point of view, what the governments are doing or not doing, but any solutions that come to your mind, what you've been gathering in terms of a long-term solution to this crisis?
Thanks, Ramit. So what's really important is because we need to see how the migrant workers who are returning can be reintegrated. And at the same time, it also means how do they get new employment? At the same time, how do they prepare to kind of repatriate again back to countries, because it's going to be a while till that is happening. So also it's important in terms of reskilling them, giving them options in terms of alternate employment trainings and all that. And a lot of countries are doing that. I mean, well, not very effectively at the moment, but some really have. And there are very few countries that have policies, and fortunately, like Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in the region that has a proper reintegration policy. So that would be, really helpful in moving this. But at the same time, there are like international bodies that are doing, that have produced some really good guidance for businesses as well as for governments as well as for employers. So IOM has an excellent guidance for employers and businesses on protection of migrant workers during the COVID-19 crisis. So that is during the crisis, but also with thinking about the way forward. And these are not just for them; it's also useful for government as a reference point. And also, there's a guidance for labor recruiters to enhance migrant worker protection during the current health crisis that IOM has done as well, because as we can all imagine, like at a time like this, there would be a lot of unethical recruitment practices because of the fact the desperation of the workers right now. So it's really important that government as well as private sector act responsibly. And at the same time, it's really critical that the UN agencies actually work collectively and come up with a concerted collective strategy to address these issues, and also they're in a position to influence and advocate with governments to do the right thing.
Thanks, Anisha. Cynthia, if I may come to you, and you mentioned that, in the oil and gas sector, the issue of migrant workers or the worker impact is not as serious as some of the other sectors that we have been talking about, and also the questions have been largely around those sectors. But in a post-COVID situation, how do you see your sector or business in general and supply chains in general? What will they look like? Will it be any different from what they previously were? Or will companies and businesses still do better in terms of risk management and preventing the next pandemic? Where do you see the change coming along?
Well, I think in our sector specifically, we will learn from what's happened. As I mentioned to you before, we had a little bit of exposure in the past in some areas of operations, with Ebola, or some countries had H1N1 as a a major public health crisis. So I think there are different questions now that we need to ask. We need to there was a question, I think, whether we're really going to focus just on tier one, or how do we look at, further down the value chain where you don't have a contractual relationship, but they're still part of, contributing to your products and services. As an industry, I think we're trying to do better in terms of how do we effectively work with our tier one contractors to ensure that, that they translate what they know about human rights to what they can do about it. So I think right now, especially in Malaysia, this last couple of years, what we found is that it's not that people don't know about respect for human rights. They do. That taking that step to doing something about it in the value chain is something that needs to be, it's probably the next step. So I think that, as an industry, we'll continue to focus very greatly on our value chain, our supply chains. We're probably, or at least I can say that for our company, this crisis has really opened our eyes to other hidden figures, as it were, in terms of the labor and working conditions space. What I mean is, migrant workers, undocumented workers, they're not really. I wouldn't say they're not a major factor, but it's just that it's not as key an issue as it is in other sectors. But I think in our industry, it's probably more of an unknown, and we probably need to work a little bit more on finding out, is there a problem, or if so, what's the scale of it? Because you find this segment of the workforce hidden away from from main contractors and the companies that get into relationships with them. They're further down the line, so they're out of sight. So I would say that there is some work to do. This pandemic has opened our eyes to some of the other human costs that come up, that have figured very heavily in other sectors. So, if you have a diversified business like ours, you find that, perhaps there is some touch points that we're not aware of. So it goes back to the main issue of due diligence. We need to have a look at our processes again to see, are they as really resilient and robust? This is the worst case scenario, I think. So, in a worst case scenario situation, how do they hold up? So work is still ongoing in that space. We're not, I think as an industry, you don't find, the energy sector being particularly vocal when it comes to, our COVID-19 responses, primarily because, we're some ways removed from consumers, in many respects. But it doesn't mean that the industry is not doing anything. In fact, it's doing quite a lot, and a lot of the work is actually within the supply chain. But this is a conversation that I think that we'll be having as an industry much, much more, bringing into account, things that Anisha has been saying, about migrant workers, etc. Putting in that kind of flavor and that sort of a lens to see, to what extent do we have this issue, or if at all we have this issue at all. So yeah, a lot of work on due diligence, supply chains, and also I think coming back to the point about access to remedy, I think grievance mechanisms. It's also another conversation within our industry that's quite quite robust, because grievance mechanisms can be effective, or they can be just a checkbox. What we're trying to do is to make sure that they're effective.
The experience that we've had over the last couple of months actually has shown that
with that trust involved in building, in implementing the mechanisms, we get a sense of what's happening outside our line of sight.
Right.
So I think that's a good learning that we've had, and it shows us that we're probably on the right path in terms of pushing on with the mechanisms, ensuring that they're not just there but implemented effectively.
Sure.
So I would say on these two key points, on due diligence, especially within the supply chain, and enhancing access to remedy, is two key learnings that we've had. And I think we'll come out at the other end of the pandemic probably stronger in these areas.
Okay. Thanks, Cynthia. And my colleague Luisa has been, really helping me with filtering those so many questions, because it's impossible for me to go through all of these questions while listening to the conversation. So thanks, Luisa, for this. So I'm going to pick one question which says some industries are thriving better than others during the time of the pandemic. And is there a collective responsibility for businesses to ensure economic continuity take precedence? And Sophia and Josephine, I mean, if you would like to just respond to this question, to bring in your perspective of what businesses can do collectively. Sophia, if you may want to go first, and then Josephine.
Sure. And I agree with the comment and the question that we are seeing that some industries are doing better, and that may be because of the nature of their industry. It may also be because the industry is more prepared. It has more of the procedures and the policies in place to handle these sorts of crises. So when we talk of the collective action around business, I think there have been times before where industries have worked together on particular issues, on particular supply chains, whether that's forced labor issues in a particular commodity supply chain, or child labor issues, and we have seen them because of the collective action and the power behind large businesses working together. We have seen results from those actions, and I think that there is a possibility for that to happen here. And I think that businesses in these sectors that have proven to be more resilient, that have proven to be able to protect their employees, to protect the communities where they're operating in it, creating standards whether it be an industry standard around a particular commodity or a particular sector on how to respond and how to behave in a time of crisis. Is a very effective mechanism because we've seen evidence of it happening in the past. I think that businesses, when they work together, particularly across within their sectors or in some cases across industries, there is a more effective tool in responding to situations. And I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that this could happen here, where businesses can seek to collectively respond to some of the issues that we've seen, whether it be some of the migrant labor issues, issues with supply chains, and with contract management. So I do think that it's an interesting idea, and I think that if businesses are able to organize collectively around it, I think it could be quite successful.
Josephine, any ideas on what would collective action look like?
I would say that, first of all, the industries, work together with the Chamber of Commerce. They are working, they are discussing very closely on what are the things that they need to do best in order to survive. And I believe the Indonesian government has also launched stimulus packages to support those businesses by who are hit the hardest by relaxing taxes, extending, what's the time frame in order for the businesses to be able to pay taxes. But on the other hand, what I heard from the Chamber of Commerce is that we can't stand still. We need to be doing something. We cannot depend on the government because businesses needs to survive and go forward. So in their own way, they are trying, and I believe between businesses and between sectors and industries, they are learning, they are sharing their experience and getting, support from, I believe like banks is also launched some stimulus packages for businesses in order for them to start their business again after they were being hit. But I would like to say that businesses, what I see, at least from the survey, from the interviews that we conducted, they do care for the employees and the communities around them, try to protect them from COVID. And businesses at this point of time, I think, have launched a large amount of funds in order to protect the community, to make sure that their employees, their communities, their supply chain, make sure their well-being and make sure that their livelihood also stays.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Of course, there are businesses that need support, and when they don't have cash, what can they do?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Great. So we only have about 8 minutes left, and I see that a lot of you have already answered some of the questions directed to you. So I'm just going to read out 2 questions and then ask all of you to just give your closing comments in about a minute or so. So there's one question from Vidya Tiku. Is there a need to change the supplier code of conduct to incorporate the learning of the pandemic? She wants your opinion on this. And the other question is quite an interesting one. I see the pandemic is like a serial killer who killed business and industry one by one as they link to each other. Would like to hear panelists' point of view on which country in the region provides best collaboration between government and business in protecting workers. So if you could just try and answer these questions in your closing comments in about a minute. And I don't know, Salil, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sorry, no, I was mute. I didn't notice that. No, I can try. No, so I think the question about supplier code of conduct, I mean, I I see great value in Vidya's question, and hello Vidya. I mean, not seen you in a while, but it's good to see you in the panel. Yeah, but um, codes of conduct ultimately rely on, and I don't want to bring up the whole issue of voluntary, mandatory issue all over again. But whenever we talk about supplier code of conduct, we're still talking about good faith, good sense, good conduct, and good behavior that is expected in a voluntary sense. And I think we need to move a bit beyond that. And I think one thing that a lot of businesses are now getting to realize that they have vulnerabilities they had not seen because they were not visible. And this is, I mean, even a large oil company such as Petronas, that yes, directly it does not have migrant workers, but probably the person who's involved with their gardening, the bus transport company which takes their workers from point A to point B, the driver or the cleaner could be someone who is a migrant worker. There are all those vulnerabilities which were invisible are going to be visible to companies. And I think the only way it can be done is not through a code of conduct very much, but something that is much more vigorous, such as contractual relationships. And I think formalizing these relationships in a more ethical and sound manner that respects the right of the individual is going to be important. Now, which country has done a good job? I don't know. I can't speak for that in companies and government, but I know that the Indian state of Kerala appears to have done very well in terms of anticipating and addressing the crisis that they've had. South Korea seems to have done very well with its own, but I'm talking about a more broader plane rather than simply talking about interrelation with company. But initially I mentioned South Korea, Singapore, to some extent Hong Kong and New Zealand as the countries that have done well. So I would want to see what role companies played there to enable the governments to respond better.
Thanks, Salil. Anisha, would you like to go next? Closing remarks, 1 minute.
Yes, and I can only also really echo what Salil is saying, because I'm totally, I totally agree with what he's saying on this, because there's no silver bullet for this. And in terms of saying examples of what, good companies were examples of where it's worked really well, I think it's still a bit premature to talk about that. I think we need to give it a little more time to really see who is going to rise above. But again, at the end of the day, it is about what we emphasized and what all the other panelists also said. It's about having those longer term relationships and connections and partnerships, contracts, and just the contractual obligations need to be very transparent. And again, this goes back to talking about human rights due diligence in times like this. It's to get it right. And quite honestly, this pandemic has only magnified the problems that were there before. So it's not to say that these are new problems that arose out of the pandemic. It's just been doubly magnified. So it's really critical that companies take this as a wake-up call, and governments as well. And at the same time, neither the government or the private sector or civil society can address and come up with sustainable strategies for the longer term on their own. So what I strongly believe is it's all about collaboration and partnerships. And going forward, it couldn't be more important.
Thanks, Anisha. I've been told that there are just 2 minutes. So quickly, Josephine, Sophia, and then Cynthia.
Okay, well, I would say that I would agree that building up relationships, trust each other, communicating, not putting in the distance. You're seeing from the distance and then you're saying something. Clarify that. When we talk about business and human rights, a lot of businesses are maybe not understanding what is it, but they're already practicing it in a way that maybe they have a code of conduct on business human rights written on their policy, but they're doing it. So, right.
Thanks. Sophia, quickly. Sorry, Sophia, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Governments in the region who have done a good job. I think I would have to agree with the other panelists that, we still have to see, the verdict is still out on this. I think, governments who are taking the time to look at some of the guidelines that have been many guidelines on business and human rights that are being published, that are being directed toward business, but governments can also use those tools as part of their planning for recovery. And then in turning to the question on code of conducts, I think that businesses should develop, whether it's a code of conduct or something stronger, in their contractual relationships or in their standard operating procedures, plans for these types of emergencies. I think that companies who have these plans in place, whether it be in their own operations or in their supply chains, will be better prepared when the next crisis comes along. And I think that this crisis has highlighted that. And I think that the relationships that businesses have with their supply chains can also move this process along. Ultimately, I think the businesses who are prepared to put this human-centric focus first will be more resilient as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. And Cynthia, before the webinar kicks us out, final comments.
Okay, I think supply chain resilience is key, and there are two areas to it: codes of conduct as well as enhanced contractual requirements. So those are the two building blocks that I think are going to take us through to the other side better.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think we finished almost in time. So thanks for attending, and thanks for the panelists for sharing your wonderful perspective. I think this was very, very insightful for all of us. I will not try to summarize this, but we have taken the questions with us. So we'll share with you all. And if there are any other unanswered questions that you would like to address, please feel free to do so. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.